In 2024, in a rural area of Japan, Osamu looked at the summer cicada that had perished from the scorching heat in the water channel, unconsciously quickening the motion of the cigarette between his fingers. He inhaled and exhaled the smoke one puff after another, yet could not extinguish the turmoil brewing deep within his heart. Nagasaki's midsummer is usually dry, and the villagers had been frequently complaining about the searing heat for days. Unexpectedly, on that very day, Nagasaki experienced a rare downpour that took the life of his only son, Akihiro. Since the shipyard's closure, Osamu had been trapped in unemployment. He had not sought another job, for from the moment his son passed away, Osamu's life had come to a complete standstill. He confined himself in this rural cottage, guarding his son Akihiro's memorial tablet, spending his days in a daze, wasting time. Osamu's despair ultimately led his wife, Keiko, to decide to leave him. He became a pitiful figure in the eyes of others, a middle-aged man who lost his son, alone, and accomplished nothing. In the face of the surrounding criticism, Osamu remained indifferent, still guarding this empty house, repeating the numb years. In the blink of an eye, it was the anniversary of his son Akihiro's death, and his wife Keiko, who had been away from home for a long time, returned that day. Coincidentally, as soon as Keiko stepped into the house, Osamu's sister Asako came to visit with her niece Yuko. As it turned out, Asako was preparing to open a store, and since it was summer vacation, she was busy with the shop's decoration and had no time to care for her daughter Yuko, so she wanted to leave the child with her brother Osamu for a while. However, taking care of a child is far more demanding than raising a pet, and Osamu, who could barely manage his own livelihood, could hardly take good care of Yuko. Asako did not give her brother a chance to refuse and hurriedly left her daughter behind. Keiko, as the aunt, seeing the helpless Osamu and the hurried Asako, knew there was no one to rely on, so she proactively prepared a room for Yuko to settle in temporarily. Keiko told her niece that despite the house being cluttered with junk in the past, the view from the window was quite beautiful. Keiko asked Yuko if she could see the now-closed shipyard by the port. She had always thought that the reddish hue around the shipyard was the glow of the sunset. It was only later that she realized it was merely the mottled marks left by rust after the buildings and equipment had been idle for too long. The closure of the shipyard affected the livelihoods of countless people in the small town. Machida was a driver for a taxi company, but prior to that, he had worked as a machinist at the shipyard for 30 years. No one could have imagined that the shipyard, which had been in operation for decades, would suddenly close, leaving Machida lost and directionless. He felt confused and helpless, unsure of what kind of work he could still do, and eventually managed to find this job as a driver. Every time Machida sees Osamu, he can't help but sigh, feeling that he is truly unfortunate. Machida often thinks to himself that if he could be as young as Osamu, 20 years younger than he is now, he would definitely venture into the big city and would never be like Osamu, who becomes despondent and idle after losing his job. On this day, Osamu went out to meet with old colleagues from the shipyard for a gathering. Kohei, who was in a similar situation as Machida, quickly found a new job after being unemployed and is now working as a security guard at the company. Among the three close friends, only Osamu is still unemployed at home. After the gathering, everyone went to Osamu's house to continue drinking. Kohei cannot stand seeing Osamu in such a depressed state and does not want to see him continue to languish. After a few rounds of drinks, Kohei finally spoke up, advising Osamu to go to a job placement agency to look for a job and gradually adjust his state of mind. Seeing that Osamu remained unmoved, Kohei, in a moment of impatience, unconsciously raised his tone. Kohei scolded Osamu for doing nothing at home all day. Doesn't he feel ashamed? This remark immediately angered Osamu, and the two began to argue fiercely. In the end, it was Machida who mediated from the side, constantly persuading them, which finally prevented the situation from completely spiraling out of control. As night deepened, Osamu noticed that Keiko had not yet returned, and he knew she would not be coming home tonight. Under the influence of alcohol, he casually asked Kohei if he knew where Keiko was living now. However, upon hearing this question, Kohei suddenly appeared flustered, his gaze flickering, and his words became hesitant. Osamu, seemingly oblivious, turned to ramble on about other trivial matters. That night quietly passed in such a confusing atmosphere. On the other side, Yuko did not want to trouble her uncle, so she went to a convenience store at the corner to work part-time early the next morning. As she was organizing the items on the shelves, her colleague Tadayama approached her, greeted her, and invited her to a drinking party on Friday. Yuko did not immediately agree, as she was still new and unfamiliar with the local people and affairs. More importantly, She knew that her time here was limited and did not want to form deep ties with the people here to avoid added sadness when parting in the future. After work, Yuko returned to her place and, not knowing where her uncle had gone, turned on the fan and examined the layout of the entire house. At that moment, she noticed many pencil lines drawn on the doorframe. Looking at the height marked next to it, Yuko realized that these were used to record a child's growth and height. She suddenly thought of her uncle's son, Akihiro, who died young, and her heart sank. These lines should have been a testament to the happy years of a family of 3. Yuko had never met this cousin, and the elders at home rarely mentioned him. She did not know her cousin's name, nor did she know why he had passed away all those years ago. But just thinking about the fact that she should have had an older brother to play with and grow up alongside made Yuko's heart feel empty, stirring up an indescribable sense of melancholy. Late at night, Osamu returned home reeking of alcohol, and Yuko finally found the opportunity to ask her uncle about her doubts. Listening to Osamu slowly recount the past, Yuko learned that her cousin's name was Akihiro, and that he had lost his life at the age of 5 due to a sudden downpour in Nagasaki. A hint of regret flashed in her eyes as she softly consoled him, saying, "Please accept my condolences." When Osamu spoke of his son's death, he remained unusually calm throughout, as if recounting a long-ago event that had nothing to do with him, without tears or sobs. However, after Yuko returned to her room, she realized on that restless night that Osamu had hidden feelings. In that downpour, it was not just Akihiro who had passed away. Osamu had also forever remained in that sorrowful moment with his son. The next day was Friday, and Yuko had intended to return home early after work to chat with her uncle, but was stopped by her colleague Tadayama on the way. Ultimately, at the enthusiastic invitation of Tadayama and his friends, Yuko went to the drinking party with everyone. A group of young people gathered together under the influence of alcohol and only dispersed at dawn. On the way home, Yuko noticed that Tadayama was always following her. She stopped and turned around to ask him what was the matter. To her surprise, Tadayama, with flushed cheeks, directly confessed his feelings for her. Yuko was momentarily stunned. They had only known each other for a few days. How could Tadayama have developed feelings for her? But then she thought, Tadayama was handsome and had a cheerful and open personality, and she felt no aversion towards him. Moreover, at her age, she had never experienced the taste of love. Perhaps she could try to accept his feelings. After a brief pause of a few seconds, Yuko nodded in agreement, officially starting her relationship with Tadayama. Experiencing the taste of love for the first time, Yuko's heart was filled with uncontrollable joy and excitement. The next morning, she asked for leave from the convenience store, and even during meals at home, she felt restless, eagerly hoping to finish eating quickly and go meet Tadayama. Osamu noticed his niece's unusual behavior and, out of a sense of responsibility as an elder, couldn't help but ask a few more questions. The Yuko who had been worried about her uncle last night now seemed to have changed. She felt displeased with her uncle's strictness, and after her feelings were exposed, her cheeks turned red. Yuko hurriedly tidied up the dishes and quickly left the house. Osamu couldn't help but be astonished. His niece had only been in Nagasaki for a week and was already in a relationship. Osamu looked out at the scenery, feeling a wave of daze in his heart. No matter how the circumstances around him changed, the people beside him seemed to be constantly moving forward. Some fell in love, some were busy making a living, and no one chose to stay in place. Perhaps he really should heed Kohei's advice and go to the employment agency to try and find a job. The hangover from last night had not completely faded, and Osamu's steps were still a bit unsteady. He braved the scorching sun and ran around all morning, but ended up with nothing. No employer was willing to hire him. The positions he was interested in rejected him for being too old, while the jobs that were willing to hire him were beneath his dignity. After running around all morning, it was ultimately in vain. Just as Osamu was about to go home to rest, a phone call from Machida's wife left him momentarily stunned. Machida had unexpectedly passed away. Osamu hurriedly rushed to Machida's home and saw from a distance that a mourning banner had been hung at his doorstep, with guests in plain mourning clothes standing silently in the courtyard to pay their respects. Seeing this, Osamu realized that his attire was inappropriate and turned to go home to change. However, before he could take 2 steps, he was stopped by Kohei's wife, Shigeko. Shigeko had a prominent scar on her forehead, and she informed Osamu that Machida had crashed directly into the tram tracks while driving due to fatigue. However, what Shigeko really wanted to question was another matter, whether her husband Kohei had an improper relationship with Osamu's wife, Keiko. Under Shigeko's piercing gaze, Osamu couldn't help but lower his head, avert his eyes, and quietly admit that he had sensed this long ago. Upon hearing Osamu's response, Shigeko, who had barely managed to maintain her composure until then, suddenly lost control of her emotions and became agitated. Shigeko pointed to the scar on her forehead and asked Osamu if he knew how it had come to be. It was from a recent cycling accident. She had been so preoccupied with this matter that she momentarily lost focus and crashed into a utility pole. Yet, even with such an injury, the issue of her husband's infidelity continued to haunt her mind, making it difficult for her to maintain a normal life. Shigeko's voice was filled with sorrow and anger. Why could Osamu remain so indifferent? Why had Osamu failed to manage his own wife, instead ruining someone else's life? The more Shigeko spoke, the more agitated she became, even reaching out to tightly grip Osamu's arm. In contrast to Shigeko's hysteria, Osamu merely stood there in a daze, still like an outsider, with no apparent emotional turmoil on his face. Shigeko's words, however, revealed the truth that Osamu had long been deliberately avoiding. The wife who burned incense and worshipped their son's memorial every day had already betrayed him, betrayed this family, and had gotten together with his best brother. Since their son's death, Osamu had been indifferent to everything outside. No matter what changes occurred, his heart would not stir in the slightest. But at this moment, an indescribable embarrassment and awkwardness wrapped around Osamu like a tide, making him want to flee the Machida home immediately. Osamu ran home in a frenzy, and the moment he pushed open the door, he stumbled upon his niece Yuko being intimate with her boyfriend. The two hurriedly separated, but Osamu had already exhausted all his strength to scold them. He walked straight into the changing room to put on morning clothes, and just as he slipped on the coat, Keiko unexpectedly returned, clearly also there to change clothes in preparation for visiting the Machida family to pay their respects. Osamu's anger surged instantly. He chased into the changing room and questioned Keiko why she would act in such a manner. But thinking of the two children outside, Osamu suppressed his anger and returned to his usual despondent demeanor, then donned a black suit and walked toward the Machida home. In the changing room, Keiko quickly calmed the panic on her face. She called Yuko over to help zip up her skirt. Keiko softly apologized to Yuko, saying she shouldn't have let the child witness that scene. But before Asako came to pick her up, she could only ask Yuko to endure a few more days. Yuko did not know what had happened between her uncle and aunt, but she could clearly sense the tense atmosphere between them. Recalling the pencil lines marking heights she had seen not long ago, she had thought it was a home filled with love. But now, looking at her uncle's lonely figure drinking alone, her aunt's eyes barely hiding panic, and the brief argument they had just had, the image of this home was completely different from the warmth and harmony she had imagined. In the throes of young love, Yuko looked at her aunt's pale face and suddenly felt an inexplicable fear. Do people who have been together for a long time eventually end up in such a state, full of exhaustion and estrangement? Yuko suppressed the myriad of confusions in her heart as she watched her uncle and aunt leave the house one after the other. And the argument that had just occurred seemed as if it had never happened at all. After waking up from a hangover, Osamu still went out to drink with old friends. Keiko still refused to step through the door, even half a step. All the problems remained unresolved, and nothing had changed. After work tonight, Yuko was pulled to a bar by Tadayama's friends. She really disliked the noisy atmosphere of the bar. The deafening music and reckless laughter made her feel uncomfortable all over. She endured the torment for several hours, and finally found an excuse to return home alone under the cover of night. Yuko clearly understood in her heart that while she could avoid today, how would she gently refuse when her friends invited her again tomorrow? The night sky was exceptionally clear, the stars' outlines reflecting vividly in the pristine darkness. Osamu pulled out a telescope from the storage room, adjusting the focus for Yuko while softly advising her. There's no need to force yourself to participate in social events you dislike. Interacting with people you don't get along with will only add to your worries. After hearing this, Yuko couldn't help but tease. Perhaps her uncle's clarity and openness were precisely why her aunt was reluctant to return home. Osamu was momentarily taken aback, then chuckled softly a few times. After adjusting the telescope, he quietly got up and left. Yuko held the cold telescope lens, and a sudden thought flashed through her mind. This telescope looked as good as new, but the size of the tube seemed a bit small, as if it were made specifically for children. Her uncle must have bought it back then, intending to use it together with her cousin Nariaki when he was older to gaze at the stars at night. The next morning was just another ordinary workday. Osamu still went out to drink with his old friends, while Yuko brought her boyfriend Tadayama back home. With no one around, the two were getting quite affectionate when a sudden cry escaped Yuko's lips. It turned out she had cut her arm on a shard of glass that had fallen to the ground at some point. Tadayama hurriedly fetched the first aid kit, carefully disinfecting her wound and wrapping it with a bandage. Yuko sat quietly beside him, listening to the noisy cicadas outside the window, feeling the unique heat of Nagasaki's summer. She suddenly asked Tadayama if, when the atomic bomb fell, everything had vanished after a blinding flash. In the afternoon, Tadayama had to go to work at the convenience store, while Yuko had been frequently taking leave recently and was dismissed from her job the day before. She saw her boyfriend out the door, and Tadayama gazed at the bandage on her arm, softly saying he wished this wound would never heal, so he could always take care of her and be by her side. Yuko shook her head, softly replying that there are no wounds that never heal in this world. In the end, everything would slowly fade away like that flash from years ago, lost in the flow of time. As Yuko and Tadayama exchanged sweet nothings, they passed by a house where Yuko inadvertently caught sight of her Aunt Keiko walking out of a strange man's home, their demeanor intimate, clearly indicating an unusual relationship. Keiko awkwardly nodded at Yuko, but Yuko turned a blind eye, suppressing her anger as she walked straight ahead with Tadayama. While her uncle was still struggling to support this family, her aunt had long since thrown everything to the wind, unwilling to even make a slight pretense. She was truly heartless. Yuko's arrival ultimately cast a stone into Osamu's stagnant life, creating ripples that spread outward. Osamu finally stepped out of his house and found a job as a chef at a restaurant. At this moment, Osamu was holding a kitchen knife, chopping away at a large bone with all his might. The force of the blade striking the cutting board made his arms numb, and his head felt a bit heavy. Yet he did not stop his actions, as if he wanted to pour out all the accumulated frustration in his heart over the years onto this large bone. After finally enduring until the end of his shift, Osamu decided to go to a tavern and got drunk, dragging his heavy steps back home. Under the influence of alcohol, Osamu let go of the strength he had been holding on to for so long. As soon as he stepped through the door, he collapsed onto the floor, curling up into a ball, repeatedly murmuring his son's name. It was he who had failed to take care of his son, allowing Akihiro to run out into the pouring rain. It was he who felt guilty towards Akihiro. It was he who had destroyed this family with his own hands. Osamu mumbled his confessions incoherently, his voice filled with years of suppressed sobs. The guilt and self-blame that had been buried in his heart for years finally turned into fragmented whimpers after getting drunk, floating in the air. Standing by was Yuko, her eyes filling with pain and worry. Once summer vacation was over, she would be leaving Nagasaki, and by then, without her company, how would her uncle endure those difficult years alone? Uncle, when will he truly be able to pick himself up? From the first day Yuko arrived in Nagasaki, she had been prepared to leave. Therefore, when she heard her boyfriend Tadayama seriously say the next day that he wanted to be with her for life, Yuko suddenly panicked. Because in her view, nothing in this world is eternal. A shipyard that has been running for decades can close overnight. The friendship between her uncle and aunt that has lasted for decades can reach a dead end, and she is merely a passerby here, not stopping for anyone, let alone giving such a heavy promise of forever. Just as Yuko expected, the local Kohei came to bid farewell to Osamu today. It turned out he had found a job at a shipyard in Busan and would be leaving this land he had lived in for most of his life the next day. Since Machida's passing, Osamu's only close friend had been Kohei. With Kohei's departure, Keiko would probably follow him far away as well. Sure enough, not long after, Keiko came to find Osamu with a divorce agreement in hand, saying she wanted to go to Busan with Kohei. Osamu showed no signs of surprise, calmly signed his name, and even chatted with Keiko about the new chef job he had recently found, as if they were old friends. Seeing Osamu looking so revitalized, Keiko let out a sigh of relief. This way, she could leave without any worries. Keiko also said that she wanted to forget all the people and things related to Nagasaki, and even did not plan to take Akihiro's memorial tablet with her, preparing to start a new life in Busan. Listening to Keiko's carefree words, Osamu, who had just been forcing a smile, could no longer maintain the smile on his face. Indeed, everything he had just done was merely a facade of calmness. After all, that was the person who had been by his side for decades. Even if their friendship had long since faded, it was impossible to truly be at peace. An absurd thought suddenly emerged in Osamu's mind. Perhaps Akihiro had never existed from the very beginning. Perhaps those past years and those warm memories had never truly happened. Otherwise, how could Keiko so decisively abandon everything? Facing Osamu's murmurs, Keiko only thought he was overly sad and had lost his senses. Akihiro had certainly existed, They had once had a lovely child together. But nothing in this world is unchanging. Beautiful pasts gradually fade, and those heartbreaking memories will also be slowly smoothed over by time. Because one must always look forward, one must learn to reconcile with the past. Keiko picked up the signed divorce agreement, turned, and walked out of the house to meet Kohei, who had been waiting outside. The two of them left side by side, just as Yuko, returning home, happened to bump into them. Yuko was seething with anger. She quickly stepped forward to stop Keiko, firmly stating that she would take good care of her uncle and that she would no longer need to worry. As soon as Yuko stepped into the house, she couldn't wait to tell her uncle about her plans. She wanted to take her uncle to find a new place to live, to a city where no one knew them, and to start life anew. What she did not expect was that Osamu's reaction was particularly intense. The emotions that had been bottled up for years completely lost control at that moment. He violently shook off Yuko's hand, grabbed a cup from the table, and threw it hard to the ground, then overturned the bookshelf with all his might, scattering the items in the room everywhere. He could seek a new livelihood. He could strive to pick himself up. He could try to find a new direction in life. But he absolutely could not leave this place. Here was Akihiro's memorial tablet, the traces of a family that had lived here. This place carried all his past and memories, and he could not easily abandon it. At that moment, a sudden sound of pattering rain came from outside. Large raindrops fell on the roof and window frames, making a crackling sound. Yuko threw aside her earlier displeasure, excitedly rushing into the pouring rain, singing and dancing, her face full of joyful smiles. Then, Yuko ran into the kitchen, took pots and pans, and went into the courtyard to collect rainwater. The rain soaked her hair and clothes, but Yuko didn't care at all. In the end, she returned inside with a basin full of rainwater, presenting it to Osamu as if it were a treasure. In the hopeful gaze of Yuko, Osamu lowered his head and took a sip. The sweet and refreshing taste slid down his throat, bringing a rare coolness of midsummer that gradually relaxed his tense nerves built up over the years, and a sense of long-lost joy inexplicably arose in his heart. This was one of the only 2 heavy rains in Osamu's memory in Nagasaki. The last heavy rain took away his son Akihiro, took away all his hopes for life, causing his world to completely collapse, plunging him into endless despair and self-blame. And this heavy rain brought a long-awaited coolness, brought the vibrant vitality of Yuko, and more importantly, brought a glimmer of opportunity, giving him the courage to face the past again. For Osamu, heavy rain had once been a symbol of destruction, an unbearable scar on his heart. But this time, the rain felt like a gentle cleansing, dispersing the gloom that had surrounded Osamu for many years, allowing him to finally awaken. Even if the past cannot be changed, life still holds the possibility of healing. Recently, while chopping ribs in the kitchen, Osamu accidentally cut his finger. He pressed on the bleeding wound and suddenly fell into a daze. Could this also be proof that life is changing? The past years were numb and stagnant, where even pain could not be felt. But now, he could feel the piercing pain from a cut finger, sense a bit of liveliness from Yuko's arrival, and experience genuine refreshment from the arrival of a heavy rain. These fragmented and tangible sensations were gradually pulling Osamu out of the mire of the past. Not long after the rain stopped, the blazing sun hung high in the sky again, and the air was still filled with the oppressive heat of summer. In the dry waterway at the entrance, there still lay a summer cicada that had perished from the heat. The summer vacation was also nearing its end, and Asako had come today to pick up her daughter to go home. She informed her brother that this might be their last meeting, as she would be moving to Canada with her daughter. Before leaving, Yuko gifted her hat to Osamu. She hoped that in the sweltering Nagasaki, this hat could bring a touch of midsummer coolness to her uncle. The distant port remained silent, and the rust-red shipyard still stood out in the sunlight like the afterglow of the setting sun. And that hat not only shielded Osamu from the scorching summer sun of Nagasaki, but also gave him the courage to live anew. Those pasts that could not be washed away by the heavy rain, those pains gradually dulled by time, would slowly settle into precious memories in his heart with the companionship of this hat, guiding him to step forward with determination, one step at a time.